Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for your patience. Lovely to see such a large subscription to this webinar this afternoon. Welcome to the South Wales Chamber of Commerce webinar specifically dedicated to crisis management. My name is Paul Slevin, President and Chair of the Chamber of Commerce, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you this afternoon, and specifically to extend a welcome to Professor Carwyn Jones and Professor Dylan Jones-Evans. Both of those names will be familiar to everybody, I'm sure. Carwyn Jones, the former First Minister for Wales, who in his time politically has seen a number of fairly significant challenges, including the last financial meltdown that we went through of 2008 and 9. And he will be giving us perspective on the political thinking and the activities going on within the Welsh Government and potentially the Westminster Government on how they're thinking, how they're reacting, and the thought processes that they will be adopting in order to steer us as a nation and as an economy through this. From a business perspective, we've brought in Professor Dylan Jones-Evans. Dylan, as you know, is a well-known member of the Welsh Society, and he brings with him the academic and deep business knowledge where that crisis management experience can be brought into companies across Wales. The process for the webinar is very simple. Because of the number of participants we have, all of the participants have been muted. Sorry about that, but it would be nearly impossible to coordinate a live question and answer session on that basis. So we'd ask you, please, if you would, to look down at the bottom of your screen. You will find there's a Q&A panel there. Click on that, and please feel free to enter questions on that as thoughts occur to you during the discussions. Carwyn and Dylan will debate for a little while the issues around crisis management, give us some insight into both the political and business side of that, and then we will pick up questions and, if possible, like to try and get to a situation where there's a good debate and conversation going on amongst our presenters. At the end of the session, we will have a survey which we'd ask you to complete, and that survey will help to guide us about subjects and matters and quality, etc., for future webinars as they arise. And just so that you're aware, this session is being recorded. Our presenters are aware of that recording. And for everybody who's taking part this afternoon, you will be emailed a link to that recording later today. And for other people who may wish to subscribe in that, there will be a link available on our website for use probably from tomorrow on. So enough from me. If I may pass over to Professor Carwyn Jones to take us through the political thinking around this crisis. Carwyn.
Thank you very much, Paul. I hope you can all hear me, Pnawn da bawb, and I hope everybody is keeping safe. What I thought I would do, just to kick off with, is to try and give you an insight into what I think is happening in government, based on my experiences over the past 20 years, rather than any contemporary knowledge, if I can put it that way. But I was somebody, of course, who came through foot and mouth disease 20 years ago now, nearly, and a lot of people have said to me, well, isn't this similar? Well, it is and it isn't, in the sense that with foot and mouth disease, the intention was to actually cull the animals that were infected, which is not, I'd suggest, the main objective of government now. And secondly, of course, the disease was quite localized in many, many ways. It wasn't the kind of disease that was going to travel all over Wales because of its very nature. So the circumstances are quite different. I've been surprised in talking to businesses since I left government about how little people know about the workings of government. People want to know what's going on in ministers' minds. People say to me, well, things move a little slowly, and I've tried to explain why that is. If you're First Minister, it's like being the chief exec of a listed company where you have a shareholders meeting every week, where you have to explain yourself to the shareholders who happen to be full-time shareholders. So inevitably, there will be some methods of working that will be quite different to the private sector. So what then is guiding ministers at the moment? Well, the one thing I know will be happening is that ministers will want to be guided by advice. Nobody will go against the advice that they are getting, certainly not in this country anyway. Fortunately, we have a consensus on the best way of dealing with the disease. Many of you will see that it's become a partisan issue in the US, where even social distancing is a matter of argument. Yes, there have been some debates about PPE, there have been debates about testing, but in the main, there's been a reasonable degree of political consensus about the way forward. The main advice will be coming from the Chief Medical Officer in Wales. Bear in mind that the response to COVID-19 is devolved. Each government has its own responsibility, but sensibly, of course. You would want to move forward together, and that's what's happened so far, where all governments take similar decisions, given the fact that 3 of those governments certainly are on the same island, in England, Scotland and Wales. So to have radically different approaches across the 3 nations would be very difficult to justify. But the Chief Medical Officer for Wales, Frank Atherton, would be the main source of advice for the First Minister. Now, I know from experience that even with science, it does not mean that the advice will be uniform. There will be some people, some voices off, will be offering different advice based on what they see is the best way of dealing with the disease. If you're a social Darwinist, you would say, well, just let people get herd immunity, and yes, some people will die on the way, but that's the best thing to do for society, which a minority viewpoint, but something that's been argued in other countries. But of course, the view taken by all governments in the UK is that what we need to do is to cut down on the number of avenues that the disease has to spread, and then of course protect people, particularly the most vulnerable. In reality, no sane politician is going to go against the scientific advice that they are receiving. There is inevitably a balance that has to be struck between health needs and the needs of the economy. Now, health will be foremost at the moment because we know that the immediate objective is to make sure that fewer people contract the disease, and of course ultimately that fewer people die from the disease. Logically, that must mean that things can't get back to normal completely until such time as we have a vaccine. But that doesn't mean that things would stay as they are, to my mind, until that time. We can look at other countries, particularly countries now like Austria and Italy, to see what the effect is of their limited release away from the lockdown that they've had for a few weeks, and that will help any government to be informed of the best way forward. But what is clear is there's not going to be a sudden removal of all the lockdown restrictions in one fell swoop. It's going to be gradual, and it's a question of how gradual that can be. There are some awkward social questions that will arise. So, for example, can we move to a situation where some people, having been tested and having found to have had antibodies to the disease, have greater freedom of movement than those who haven't? I mean, some real difficult questions there for people to answer, but who knows? That might be one of the outcomes in the future, until we get to a point where we can be sure that the disease is under control. And the only time, to me, where we can be sure is when there's a vaccine. But of course, you know, being sure about things in life is not necessarily something we can aim for, and there'll be other ways of removing some of the restrictions, to my mind, in the meantime. What will Ken Skates be thinking as Economy Minister? He will see the situation as a rapidly deflating lifeboat that has to be pumped full of air to keep it afloat at the time being. That's not to say, to my mind, that he won't be thinking about anything else, about what happens in the future, but the immediate priority will be, how do we make sure that we can keep the economy afloat? And that's what happened in 2008 to 9. You had the various schemes that were put in place to help employers. This is worse. Fortunately, there is money there from the UK government, which has enabled the Welsh Government to be able to help businesses. You have the Business Wales website, which I went into again this morning. It's a pretty good guide to what's available in Wales. But the one thing I would advise everybody about is this. When you're in government, it's a bit like being in a room where you turn a switch on, and then at some point in the future, a light comes on somewhere else. You assume that's going to happen. And what you hear in government needs to be balanced with the experience of businesses on the ground. So it's hugely important for any minister to be informed of what people are actually seeing on the ground. Because what a minister will see is, we've got this scheme, this scheme, this scheme, this is the way it's going out. But it is important that there is a voice for businesses to say, well, actually, this isn't quite working the way you think, and this might be improved. That's crucial to make sure that the help that's available to business is as effective as possible. And the third point, I suppose, and final point for me, is about reopenings. What thinking will there be in government about reopenings? I think the most difficult areas to look at reopening, not just now but in the future, will be sport, theatre, cinema. Unless you create a situation where people are sitting a safe distance apart, that probably means, for example, in an all-seater sports stadium, that it will be a third full, and then having to have a way where people can be socially distanced as they enter into the ground and socially distanced as they leave the ground. So that's probably the most difficult one of all. How do you, if you're in a situation where infection is still there, how do you restrict that with major sporting events or concerts? The same thing applies, probably worse because a lot of people are standing in concerts. Again, very difficult to enforce social distancing. There are other businesses, potentially, I think, which could open earlier. For example, the supermarkets are open. People are now used to social distancing. The same thing might apply, for example, to garden centres, to DIY centres. If any of you spend time on, for example, the Wix website, you will know there's an hour's wait before you can get onto the website. People are taking the opportunity to sort their gardens out and to build things. That might be one area with the appropriate protection where businesses might be able to reopen. We're seeing some of the takeaways reopening now. For them, the issue always was protection of staff. Rather than customers. You can put a distance between yourself and a customer. And things such as, for example, to my mind, civic amenity sites. There'll be a lot of businesses who are wondering what to do with their trade waste. There will be some people who will be tempted to fly tip, unless we have a way where people can dispose of the waste that's accumulating, and domestically as well. We end up in a situation where we've already got people burning rubbish, but what happens to perhaps more dangerous waste in the future? That will have to be resolved. And to my mind, it's not difficult to put a safe system of work in place to open up those sites again and to allow people to visit in a more restricted way. I think social distancing is going to be with us for a while. I hope it's not with us for too long, otherwise the birth rate will undoubtedly drop. And it'll mean, of course, as far as businesses are concerned, it's just not possible to serve as many customers. If you're a bar or a restaurant, if you have social distancing in the very long term, it's not going to work for you. At the very least, your revenues are going to be down, and ultimately, of course, people won't be able to socialise in the way they'd want to as they go out. So I think we will see potentially, I suppose, a gradual reopening of businesses, perhaps from next month onwards. I think it'll be done on a GB basis. You can forget about Northern Ireland for now, because Northern Ireland is, it's geographically part of the island of Ireland, and that's a geographically different area when it comes to any kind of infection, whether it's animal or human. But it would make sense for businesses in England, Scotland and Wales to have the same guidance or similar guidance in terms of when to open. Doing it any other way can lead, of course, to confusion. It's going to be a long time, I think, before things get back to what we've always known as normal. I think it'll be difficult to get back to that ultimate normality, if I can call it that, before there's a widely available vaccine that's been administered to enough people to create that immunity amongst the population. And so really it's a matter of seeing the business world and the economy slowly open up again over quite a significant period of time, probably months. And then, again, for the big gatherings, for the business of sport, for example, they're probably in the most difficult situation in terms of when we might see things return to normal. I hope that's given you some idea of the kind of thinking in government. The thinking will be, how do we protect our people? How do we then look at safely reopening sectors of the economy in turn? And ultimately, of course, how do we support businesses in the meantime? And how do we allow as much economic activity as possible without creating an unacceptable risk in terms of disease spread? And that's pretty much what ministers will be guided by at the moment.
Carwyn, thanks very much indeed. That's lovely. Good to see that Heather has managed to join us. So Heather Mars, Chief Executive of the Chamber, has overcome all of the technology issues around Newport and has now joined us. And Heather will say a few words shortly. Once we've heard from Dylan Jones-Evans, who will give us the business perspective on crisis management and where we are at the moment?
To really focus on three areas, because that obviously you could say that business is relatively simple in that it's about managing cash, managing customers, and managing people. But of course, it's the complexity of that that becomes the issue as businesses grow. And of course, all those three issues are quite important now, and how you manage those three elements, both individually and together within a business, as we go through the current COVID-19 crisis. So let me start with the issue of people, which I think is probably the most important aspect. One of the things we will obviously discuss is some of the different interventions that the government at both the UK and Welsh level have put together in terms of supporting businesses. And clearly the most important one, in my opinion, has been the coronavirus job retention scheme. I think without that intervention, and clearly we still have the office for the UK government saying that it will potentially go up. The Office for Budget Responsibility saying that unemployment could go up to 2 million, but of course we're in a situation where employment is at its highest in the UK and unemployment at its lowest in the UK since records began. But I think retaining those jobs has been absolutely crucial. So the fact that employers can apply to furlough employees temporarily for up to 80% of their usually monthly salary, I think has been quite critical. And keeping those employees on board with the companies, I think is absolutely important. But then, of course, it's how you deal with those employees that you have both on furlough and, more importantly, those still working with you and for you at home. And as the majority of people now are actually working, as we all are, as you can see around me, either in a small little room in your house or sitting at the dining table in your kitchen, it's very important that the human resource element of any business is actually extended outside the organization into everybody's homes. And this is one of the things I found quite illuminating about how organizations deal with this. My own organization, University of South Wales, the most important element that we've said at every turn, every communication we have with staff, is for our staff to keep safe and to look after our family during this important time. Our business and our work is clearly important, but even more important is for us to keep safe, keep healthy, and to look after our immediate family. And I think that's the sort of message that I think many businesses now are fortunately giving across, because majority of people won't have been used to working at home. As an academic, sometimes we start working at 7 in the morning. Sometimes we finish at 2 in the morning, depending on what we need to do. The vast majority of people will be working 9 till 5. And I think a lot of organizations, a lot of businesses have to be alert to this issue of burnout, because there has to be a way of managing your employees and people who are in your line management with regard to the work that they do. The other one, and I should be on holiday this week, which is an odd thing to say, that you spend your holiday in your home for 7 days, but businesses should encourage their employees to take vacation. It's very easy now, we're in this very strange time where this boundary between work and play and rest seems to have all sort of been broken down. But I think it is absolutely critical that as an employer, you don't expect, just because your employees are home and now they're working from you from home, that they're there actually working every hour that God sends. And finally, I think more importantly is, how do we encourage our staff, our employees, to help themselves? Because you're moving away from being and communicating with people. How do you actually get those staff to help themselves? So I think, again, staff organizations need to go potentially a little bit further in monitoring the health and well-being of staff during this time, and more importantly, to, where possible, to intervene, because clearly when you have an organization where your employees are scattered all over your local area, it's not the same as calling everybody into an office or on a Zoom call. You need to monitor very carefully the situation. So then moving on to the second key, which is customers. And I mentioned, well-being was important in terms of being the key word for employees. With customers, I think it's about communication. This has been a major issue, obviously, for many businesses. All of a sudden, may have lost customers, may have customers who feel that they cannot continue their normal business relationship. So that communication becomes a key aspect, far more than we've had in the, shall we say, the pre-COVID-19 period. And in particular, I think, one of the key issues, and I've had a number of businesses call me about this, is, and I'll come to finance later, is how do you maintain this relationship in terms of getting customers to pay you? It is a very difficult balancing act for businesses from saying, we have a contract, you owe us money, you need to pay us now because we have cash flow difficulties, to actually managing that, because clearly many businesses will potentially say, well, I need to save my business first before I save yours. And having that balance, I think, between demanding payment and actually working with your clients and customers to actually pay the money due is going to be absolutely critical moving forward. And also, more importantly, remember this, as Carwyn mentioned, is a blip. We hopefully will be slowly coming out of this over the next 2 to 3 months, and there'll be then an extended period where potentially we will have to continue social distancing. But even if the economy will still be operating. So it's how we manage these relationships in the same way we manage our customer, our employee relationships. That's what's going to be key going forward. And then finally, the most important thing of all, potentially, it's not usually the most important thing of all, I would say. I'd say people and customers are more important than cash in many respects during normal times. But that whole issue about financing businesses is going to be really important, and managing that over the next 3 to 4 months. And the most important thing about that is cash. It's not about turnover. It's not about profit. It's how much cash you have in the business. So it's about preserving cash. It's about ensuring that the cash comes in, as I mentioned, from customers. And, small businesses are going to be in a very difficult position over this, far more than larger businesses. We did a piece of research actually related to Brexit to try and work out how much money was in the system, in the business community. And if you looked at the biggest companies in the UK, they have something like £775 billion on their balance sheets. Why? Because they were preparing for a no-deal Brexit. There was a danger of a no-deal Brexit for the last 1.5 years, 2 years. So they've been preparing and actually keeping that cash in. The majority of small businesses won't be in the same position. And I think the great worry at the moment is how long it'll be before the majority of businesses run out of cash. It won't be about running out of customers. It won't be about problems with their employees. It's when they actually run out of cash. And to that extent, this is where these different schemes from the UK and Welsh governments have focused on how do we get this cash out. I think there's enormous thanks and kudos that must go to the local authorities who have been applying this rate relief grant. They've been pushing out the £10,000 to businesses all across Wales. It hasn't been perfect. There have been instances I've had complaints where there has been a computer says no mentality in the minority of cases. But it's great that the local authorities have, for business who do pay business rates, have managed to get some sort of money out, usually around £10,000 more for business in the hospitality industry, and got that out very quickly. Somebody I know applied on a Monday here in Cardiff. By Wednesday morning, that money was in their bank account, and that's been helpful. But then, of course, the real challenge has been about getting access to government-backed loans to businesses. And we know this has been an issue that was highlighted only a couple of days ago, where there's been this breakdown in communication between the British Business Bank, the high street banks, and the UK government on how this works. So it was interesting to see only yesterday they were claiming £1.1 billion had gone out to 6,000 firms across the UK, and that had happened in the last few days. So I expect that to increase considerably, and I think that's really important, that the banks must forget that we're not operating in normal times. We can't apply the same rules time and time again as they've done previously and using very similar schemes previously. This money needs to go out to businesses as quickly as possible. And I know the Chancellor now is looking at other countries, for example, Switzerland, to see how quickly. I think they got something like 14 billion out within a few days to businesses all over Switzerland. And again, it may need to be revised, but I think that to me is the key here, is cash, how you manage cash within the business, but more importantly, how governments can intervene to get that support in to fill any holes that you may find by having customers not paying on time and not having enough cash reserves in the business.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. Great insight there, and some really topical and current stuff. Carwyn, can I just come back to your piece, please, and your insight into the thought process and the work that the First Minister and Ken Skates and his team are doing. As First Minister, you say it's like a chief executive's role, where you're effectively carrying the responsibility for a huge institution. And I know that somebody like Mark Drakeford would take a lot of that quite personally and take it to heart. When you were going through 2008-9 and the foot and mouth and the other various skirmishes that happened under your time, what does it feel like personally? How can we draw a lesson from somebody like you, who has had real life, huge personal and media pressure and stakeholder pressure on your shoulders? What are the lessons you can share with managers and CEOs that are listening to this about how they should deal with this? How do they cope with it? And you know, yes, there's a light at the end of the tunnel, but how do you see that now when you're really in the dark?
Talk to people, seek advice. It's not a sign of weakness not to seek advice to help. 20 years ago with foot and mouth, I was 33, 34. It was a different era. You know, if you sought advice or help, it was seen as a sign of weakness. It was a help to me to be able to come back to Bridgend where I lived, because it wasn't affected by foot and mouth. It was like a different world. But it does take it out of you. There's no question about that. But then, you know, you volunteer for the role. You know, it forces you to be a minister. At the time, what you tend to find is that the sheer speed of the situation and the adrenaline actually keeps you going. It can be quite cathartic to have a press conference every day, because then you have your chance to say what you want, to have an idea of what the media are thinking, and it's helpful actually being able to, for me, I always find it helpful to be able to stand up publicly and talk rather than sit in a corner brooding, if I can put it that way. For me, it's much easier, but each individual is different. But more than anything else, what I learned as First Minister is, and I think it's true if you're the chief executive of any large organization, listen and talk to the people you trust. They won't be the people necessarily who are working for you, because if you're at the top, people want to think that you're rock solid, and you know, I think it can discomfort people if they think the person in a position of leadership is you know, finding it difficult. But if there's someone you can talk to, there is no shame in that. And we've always, men particularly, we've always thought, you know, we are the rocks upon which the waves break. We don't need help from anyone. We just see it through, and you know, it'll all be all right. But you've got to do it yourself. You can't talk. Don't seek advice, because people will think that you're being weak. Well, it's not weakness. It's actually a sign of great strength to seek advice, to share the experiences of other people, and it does help enormously. Talking helps enormously. Keeping things to yourself, and men are particularly good at this, just makes things worse. So it's a human. At the end of the day, we talk about the world of business, but the world of business is created by human beings, and we are all affected by the way we operate as human beings. So even if you're the most successful business person in Wales, you're still a human being, and you still have to operate like a human being, and that means taking help and advice when that's available to make you a better business person and not just a better person.
Listen, let me just bring Dylan in on that too, because if your business is mothballed and your staff are furloughed and you're sitting at home, you don't have that daily press conference. You don't have that same opportunity. Dylan, what's your counsel then for managers who may be sitting at home now worried about that cash crisis that you're talking about, and how they should behave and how they should act?
Well, as I said before, it's really about communication. But I think the real challenge here is that, government can only do so much. And what I mean is that you can have all these schemes. I think the most important thing is that businesses actually get access to them and understand about them. And I think there are so many businesses out there that, I've had people that there's different types. You've got the business rate relief, you've got the government-backed loans, you've got the Development Bank Wales loans, you've got the supporting the self-employed schemes. It's very confusing at the moment. And I think it's trying to I haven't seen anything that has been out there. Obviously you get the campaign all the time saying, stay at home, stay at home, stay at home. Now we've got, 5-6 million businesses in the UK. I haven't seen anything that's come to those businesses to say, this is what's on offer for you. I don't know if government communication is slightly behind on this, or should there be a role far more for organisations like yourselves, the Chambers, to push this out? But, in the end, we've got all these businesses in the UK. They're looking for some sort of support from government. The challenge, I think, when you've got your owner manager sitting at home, having full of their staff and wanting to get access, is where to get the right support and advice. And I think that has always been the challenge, because only about 30% of at best of businesses actually use any sort of government business support. The vast majority don't. So at this time of crisis, maybe it's now about time for the communications of both Welsh Government and UK government to start pushing that message out. They know where our businesses are. How do we get that message out and say, the old adage, which this time is true, says, hi, I'm from the government and I am here to help.
It's a really interesting conversation that we're having, actually. And that was one of the questions that I wanted to ask, was that there's a lot of mixed messages out there. There's a lot of confusing news. We watch the news, we're reading stuff from government. Can I just ask perhaps Dylan to come back on that and say, where would you turn for some trusted news and some trusted insight? What would be your trusted sources that we could suggest for people to visit who are watching the webinar today?
I mean, I think you've just got to go with the official. If you're talking about the health, obviously you either you keep to the main sort of health bodies, Public Health Wales, Public Health England. That's where you get this. I mean, please don't go on Eamon Holmes' show and believe that 5G has caused coronavirus or is causing it. I don't think we even got bloody 5G in South Wales, to be honest with you. Well, not yet anyway. So, and certainly Iran hasn't got it. But I think, you've got to go for the official sources. I think one of the issues about being on social media is that you end up being in your own bubble. And by being in that bubble, you listen to it's like being with your mates in the pub, isn't it? All you listen to is your mates in the pub. Whereas I think stick to official sources. But going back to what I said, certainly in terms of business, I think, yes, we've got Business Wales there and people will turn to it. But I think at this level, I think we need a higher level. And I think we really do need to try and get both UK and the Welsh Government, and both, Ken Skates and Rishi Sunak have been doing an excellent job on this, on trying to communicate. But we need, rather than having them as talking heads, let's get that information there and out to businesses so they actually know what they can get from government.
Let me just build on that if I can, because one of the big questions, if you're in health right now, Vaughan Gething's got a very, very clear mandate, which is the health and welfare of the people. The First Minister sits there holding the reins of Welsh Government and doing his damnedest to protect the Welsh people. Ken Skates has got an invidious position right now, which is, as you said, Carwyn, earlier, his world is deflating around him at a pace. It must be hugely difficult for him to balance the economies, the GDP, the revenue, the employment, the whole infrastructural stuff of the Welsh economy against the crisis that we're facing. I mean, how do you hope to create a recovery from this? Either of you, Dylan or Carwyn.
Before I deal with that, Paul, just the point that Dylan was making there, and Heather actually, in terms of who do you listen to? What I always say to people is you have to listen to what's coming from those government press conferences.
Absolutely.
Because one of the things I did learn doing foot and mouth was you set up press conferences early on so that people get used to the idea that what you say is the truth. We didn't have social media in 2001, and still we have people, with all manner of invented stories about, the disease being spread by people and all, and none of them are true. And it's even worse now with social media, people believing all manner of, nonsense and thinking it's true. So it's absolutely crucial when it comes to health particularly, that what comes from government is important. The problem we have in Wales is that people will watch the press conferences in London, and whilst most of it will be relevant, not all of it is. And at the start, it's getting better now, but at the start of the process, it was never made clear that some things apply to England, some to Wales. That was never made clear. It is getting better. I mean, the prime example was when Boris Johnson said, right, that's it, you can't go outside, you can't do this. I knew full well he had no legal basis to do it at that time because the bill hadn't gone through. And it didn't apply to Wales anyway, because that was the Welsh Government's call. So I think that's improving, but it does show that we still have that media deficit in Wales, where people still get a lot of their news from sources in London, which inevitably they will, and not actually realising that, and it's not made clear to them, that a lot of what is said there isn't relevant to Wales. Now, in terms of Ken and his thinking, I think at the moment, the emphasis is very much on health. I don't think there is any pressure in terms of reopening the economy gradually at the moment, but I think that will come in time. People are very, very focused on the health issues at the moment, but in 2 or 3 weeks' time, you might have people saying, well, this has gone on long enough now. Sure, there must be a way of, opening the door slightly in a way that's acceptable. And I think it's at that point when things become a little bit tricky as far as what Ken and Vaughan are concerned, and Mark, of course. Now, as First Minister, Mark will want to be seen as leading the battle, but there's a fine balance to be struck with doing that and appearing to crowd out your ministers, because you can give the impression sometimes if you do that you've got no faith in them. No, he hasn't done that, in fairness. I think the balance has been absolutely right. So on the one hand, you run this risk of criticism for not being seen enough, whereas if you're on all the time, people say, well, he's clearly got no faith at all in the ministers in his own government. So I think that balance is right. But I don't think we're at the situation at this moment in time where there is pressure to have large-scale openings of the economy, despite the situation with health. If we look at the US, for example, I mean, the whole thing is partisan. Even so, as I mentioned before, even social distancing. There are even people in the US saying, well, okay, some people will die, but there we are. It's one of those things, let's open the economy up. Well, I don't think we're quite in that situation, thankfully, in the UK. So for the time being, yes, I think it's health. I think Ken will know that, Vaughan will know that, Mark will know that. But in 2 or 3 weeks' time, I think then maybe it will begin to change in terms of its balance.
And that's all driven, I guess, by infection rate and the flattening of the curve, as our Prime Minister would call it.
There'll be that, but also, usefully, it'll be driven by what's happened in other countries. Yeah. If we look, for example, at what China's done, okay, people will say, well, China, okay, it's a different society, and it is, but Austria is very similar, Italy's very similar, and there have been different approaches in Scandinavian countries. Germany is talking about easing some of the controls in the next few weeks. They might well provide us with an idea of what happens. I mean, it's a horrible way to put it, but what happens if the controls start to ease? you might see the situation, remain as it is and see that flattening of the curve and a dip in the curve. You may see the disease flaring up again. No one knows in reality. But I think it's quite useful in Europe to have different approaches by different governments, because then you can see what works and what doesn't.
That's really, really helpful. And there's a number of questions coming in on the Q&A about future planning and what we can anticipate. I think one of
Can I come back quickly on that, if you don't mind?
Yeah,
I just want to have, obviously, what we've got to appreciate as well is that we are now 3 weeks into a lockdown. Now, it's very easy to turn around and blame whatever government can say for not being prepared. That's done now. That won't change anything. Obviously, it'll never happen again. Well, if it does, that government won't be in power for too long after whatever's been happening. But I think what's really important for us to appreciate is that, and I think Carwyn made this point about, the role of the First Minister and the Prime Minister, for that matter, as essentially the CEO of UK PLC or Wales PLC. And it's about trying to get those, shall we say, different interventions in place. And I think what we've got to appreciate, and I'm going to say this from the point of view of to defend government to an extent, is that you're trying to change the direction of a tanker to some extent. Government, for whatever it tries to do, is not going to be flexible. It has certain rules, regulation, has to keep through those. There's certain processes within that. I'm sure Carwyn can explain far better. And of course, we can't expect government overnight to change, but it will change and it's putting things in place. At the same time, then I think government has to sometimes appreciate that when it does things that, when it gets it wrong, then it has to, like all the best companies survive getting things wrong, and those that say, we got this wrong and we need to change it now, like Coca-Cola did when they withdrew everything and Pepsi didn't, etc. Right? So one of the things I do want to mention, and Paul's told me that I can to an extent, is obviously the recent decision by the Development Bank. On one side, absolutely brilliant. 100 million, 1,500 companies applied. They've got all the decisions ready now to go. They're going to be landing on people's desks. And that is something that is a Wales devolution plus solution. Absolutely fantastic. On the other hand, the Development Bank have asked for personal guarantees. Now, I can see, having worked on an Access to Finance review and when Carwyn was First Minister, I know how organisations need to change. And obviously, at the time, all the banks in the UK level were asking for personal guarantees and they wanted people's houses and all this. And Rishi Sunak quite rightly said, no, it's not happening. You will not ask for personal guarantees. Anything under 250,000, you're not allowed to ask anything whatsoever. You've got to cover the risk. The Development Bank didn't follow that. Now, it doesn't seem like much, but I think from my point of view, you've got 1,000 businesses that are funded. The chances are that about 100 to 200 of those will not get through this because of the drop in the economy, because of what's happening. So if that happens, is it really right, particularly when the government's giving away £400 million in grants, to go after a few businesses for personal liability, or sorry, not businesses, individuals, at a time when they're fighting really hard to try and save their businesses? So in this case, I think, as an example, and I know, people have signed personal guarantees, it would be absolutely wonderful if the Development Bank just said, look, we actually got this wrong. We want to be the same as every other bank now in the UK. We won't ask for personal guarantees. I understand the rationale behind it, but, sometimes you do get things wrong. And, we've got to appreciate that governments can't get everything right the first time. But when government does get it wrong, let's say, we got it wrong, let's change it.
Yeah, I think that's a really valid point to make. And it was leading into the question that I was asking, trying to wrap up some of the questions, is around risk and the sorts of risks that businesses will face through this crisis. And what can we do to help businesses, or what can businesses do to help themselves anticipate those risks? And what could they do to try to identify what those are, mitigate those, given that we're in a really uncertain time? I don't know which one of you would like to come in on that, but I think actually trying to understand what risk is really important.
Do you want me to come in? Yeah, okay.
Brilliant.
So I think this is one of the things, when you're working with growing businesses, is that the most difficult thing with owner managers of growing businesses is to take them out of their business environment, because this is how they walk around. They walk around because they just see their business. They don't see, the old woods for the trees analogy. They can't step out of their business. They see the minutiae of what they're doing in that business, but they can see the greater environment. And I worked for several years on a program in Sweden where we'd end up in one of those manor houses in the middle of nowhere where, that used to be owned by the lead singer of ABBA, that sort of place. And then we'd sit there for 3 days and we'd work with the businesses and get them to trust each other. Fortunately, when I was there, they all spoke English because I speak no Swedish at all. And it was about getting them to think outside of that. Now, that I think is what's happened here. And I go back to that issue I talked about in terms of the cash that large companies had put aside for dealing with a no-deal Brexit. Most surveys showed that small businesses would never have been prepared for that. Even though, can you imagine if you'd said to them, right, actually, we're going to have a coronavirus hitting the UK in basically 6 months' time, you've got to prepare now. They wouldn't have done anything about it. So it is that chance. They wouldn't have saved the cash. They wouldn't have tried to look. Some would have, but the vast majority wouldn't have, in the same way that they didn't or wouldn't believe that there could be the possibility of a no-deal Brexit and prepared for it in terms of, keeping cash, retaining customer links, strengthening supply chains, etc. So I think the issue here is that unfortunately, most small businesses work on a day-to-day basis and they think of risk in the short term, but not in the medium or the long term. And that's potentially something that may have to change after we get out of this COVID-19 situation.
Thank you.
Can I just come in? I mean, I think one of the issues that we need to look at very carefully is what happens after most of the restrictions are lifted, because it's not going to be the case, is it, that all of a sudden people can operate more or less normally as businesses and everything goes back to normal. I mean, there'll be a substantial time lag in terms of demand and in terms of the supply chains. One of the issues that a lot of businesses have said to me is, well, we can carry on. We've got our customers, what we produce is needed, but we can't get the supply, the equipment that we need from our suppliers, because the suppliers are not around. So reconstructing the supply chain, I think, will be crucial. I think it might happen quite quickly. Who knows? But nobody can know about this, and we will see potentially some businesses who are finding it more difficult afterwards than they actually are now. So the need for government support will continue even after most, if not all, of the current restrictions have gone, because it's going to take a while for things to get back to normal. No?
Let me just come in, because in any discussion like this, there has to be one or two contentious questions. And there's a perception, isn't there, that we've been outbid as an economy on a number of the supply chains that would have been critical for this virus. How can we, as an economy and as a government, how can we protect ourselves against that? Not that we should become insular, but that we're actually becoming, if you like, slightly independent, so that we can guarantee the supply chains of equipment like PPE, like testing, whatever it is.
Well, I mean, hopefully this will make people think that buying things at the cheapest possible price is not actually good in terms of the local economy, and particularly in terms of having a secure supply chain. One of the aftermaths of foot and mouth was that people did start thinking very carefully about where their food came from, and provenance became important. People wanted to know that they were buying local. I mean, Tesco, for example, 20 years ago, the produce are the same in every supermarket. They didn't distinguish between different supermarkets in different parts of the UK. Well, they do now, even to the point of saying these potatoes came from this farm. And that made people think about, if you want to put it in economic terms, to think about the supply chain. I was talking to somebody last week, Oliver Conger last week, who many people know from British Rototherm, and he was saying, well, the problem we've got is that a lot of the kit that people need is being manufactured elsewhere, and we can't get it because the British manufacturers have all gone. And that will have to get people thinking about how we rebuild a sustainable supply chain in the future, even if there are some, it can't be extortionate, but some extra costs to make sure that when we're in a situation, if God forbid, we're in a situation like this again, that we don't end up being unable to function as a manufacturing chain because somewhere there's a break in the link because the material you need is coming from another country that isn't able or willing perhaps to supply you. So I think that is a serious question for the future. I think that will get people's minds thinking about, well, actually, we do need people manufacturing certain products in the UK. Because otherwise we end up in the situation that we found ourselves in now. The other thing which I think will exercise many businesses' minds is this. If you're a manufacturer, you need a building to manufacture in. But actually, we may end up in a situation, given where technology is now, given what we're doing now, that many businesses might say, well, why do we need a building or an office that has a sign outside it when we can just as easily operate from each other's houses? And I think that's going to be a big question in the future. Now, that works two ways. Firstly, it cuts costs inevitably, but secondly, we are human beings. We still want that level of human contact as well. But will we look at this at the situation, say, in 20 years' time and say, do you remember those days when people used to travel to a building to go to work? And for some businesses, it'll have to be that way because they're making things. But for many other businesses, they may start saying, well, hang on a second, we don't need all these people in a building. We can equip them for far less if they're at home. And then, of course, potentially there's quite a marked negative effect on the property market. All these things might come to pass in ways that we haven't even thought of yet in terms of behavioural change.
So is this the opportunity to think about reshoring a lot of this stuff, doing it in a different way, working from home, behaving completely differently? How do we actually take the best from this crisis and turn it into positive change for the future, for the economy, to avoid the risk to supply chains, to avoid the risk to people?
Well, there are two things for me. Sorry, I say this quite quickly. Firstly, the point I already made about resource, but reshoring. Secondly, I've said many times in the past that broadband in the 21st century is the equivalent of the railway lines in the 19th. You've got to get your broadband links right. They're still not right. I mean, I had my eyes open. I'm an advisor to a company on Spectrum Internet, and I had my eyes opened at the way in which most internet provision in the UK is based on trying to craft new ideas onto old technology. Still using copper cabling, but having a bit of fibre, so you can then call it fibre broadband, even though it really isn't. Whereas, of course, you've got some companies that are able to provide much, much faster, proper fibre optic broadband. And if you look at some countries like South Korea, that's just what they've done. But we still have this attitude in the UK. Well, let's just, take what we've got. Like the railway lines, take what we've got and make them a little bit better, even though you need to see a step change. And if we're really going to, to my mind, of course, Superfast Company made a difference. I was the First Minister at the time. But we have to start thinking now about the next stage, which is, and it's not cheap, but fitting out Wales and fitting out the UK with proper fibre optic broadband, and not what we've got now, which is fibre broadband with a lot of copper, to enable more home working. I don't think, there's some parts of Wales where you can do it. There's some parts of Wales where you can't. And if we're really going to be serious about helping people to work more from home, which helps with the environment, it helps with transport costs, it helps with traffic, many other ways, then it does mean we have to invest more in our broadband network in the same way as we would invest more in our transport networks.
Flies in the face of an HS2 investment, isn't it? When you put it that way. But
you need to. I mean, if you look at I will shut up in a second, but our railways are antiquated. They were built by the Victorians. They've got lots of curves in them. A lot of the tunnels are too low. Any other country would rationally have put a rail deck under the second Severn crossing and closed the Severn tunnel down because it pumps out thousands of gallons of water every day. But we just didn't do that in the UK. We tried to make do with antiquated infrastructure. And the lessons you see from France, from Italy, from Spain, is that you need actually to build proper modern infrastructure rather than simply trying to see a bit of improvement on something that's been there for donkey's years.
Okay. Dylan, did you want to come in on that? I appreciate we're running over time, but just...
No, that's fine. I totally agree. I'm not, this is not about resetting the economy to an extent. It's about building on where we are now. And also for not accepting, that I think the fact that all of a sudden you've got everybody working at home or everybody online at the time, it's actually exposed how poor, to an extent, our broadband delivery is and our mobile delivery. You know, I'm actually sitting here in the middle of Cardiff, and I've got 2 signals on my phone, which, you know, is just completely unacceptable. And I think the interesting thing, right, is that it's about this movement away from bricks and mortar to, shall we say, more flexible working. And I don't think it's going to be working from home. I think people may choose. So, for example, say you're working for a company in Cardiff, you're up in Merthyr, you may want to, because Carwyn mentioned this social issue, you may want to actually go to what I know, not even a co-working space anymore, a virtual space, where you may want to work there in the morning. When the trains are less busy, you'd come down on the train to Cardiff for a meeting potentially with a few people. I think that's going to change. When we talk about flexible working, it's going to change a lot. But I'll make one final point about this. I was talking to somebody who worked for Admiral the other day. And of course, you know, Admiral's one of the success story in Wales as our only FT 100 company. And of course, a lot of the young people working in their call centres there, they come there not because necessarily it's a great job but it's about the fact that they get to interact, and so that social interaction. So if we really expect everybody to work at home, that's not going to work. A lot of these kids are really struggling with this because they want to work in that environment where they have the social interaction as well as being paid for doing a good job. But here's the real challenge for us, and the real challenge facing both the UK and Welsh economy. If we see those sectors that have been hit and will be hit, it'll be retail, right? As we know, it'll be tourism, it'll be leisure. All these are the sectors in which the majority of the people working in them are under the age of 25, are on low wages, and are women. So when we look at who's going to be out, part of that 2 million, who the Office for Budget Responsibility have predicted will be out of a job, come October, we're going to have that generational gap again. And we're going to be back to an extent to the 1980s, where you're going to have massive youth unemployment. And now everything that we do has to be geared towards that. And I can tell you, right, you know, it may need to be, when we talk about funding infrastructure, and Carwyn's absolutely right about that, it's about how we now upskill our young people to be ready for the industries of the future to an extent that we've never even envisaged before.
That's hugely powerful stuff. And, you know, it's food for thought for all of us. We're in an environment now, and when we come out of this environment, whenever that is, whatever that looks like, we are going into a changing global world, a changing business environment for us. And I get the sense that we could continue to talk about this all day. We have reached the end of the session for now, and I know there were an awful lot of questions coming in on the Q&A. I apologise if we didn't specifically answer all of those questions, but the fact that there is a huge appetite for discussing this crisis management, I think, will give us some idea of future webinars that we will need to put on to support your businesses. All I would like to say as I close is that I hope there's a few nuggets in there will help you take some practical steps back to businesses who are dealing with unprecedented times. Can I thank our experts today, to Dylan and to Carwyn. Thank you so much for sharing your experience. Thank you for sharing your insight. For those of you listening, I hope that you have taken some interesting facts away from that. And please do get in touch with the Chamber, as we are here to help you. We have recorded this session, so you will be able to revisit any points that you missed. But as mentioned earlier, this is not formal advice because the issues are changing rapidly. So I urge you to continue to visit the Chamber website, where we have up-to-date, trusted sources of information for you from government and trusted business sources. Thank you all for joining us. Please do join us. We will be running a series of webinars next week and into the future, and keep your eye on the Chamber events page. So from myself, from Paul, from Dylan, from Carwyn, and from the Chamber team, thank you all so much for joining us today, and goodbye.